Hey, deep divers, welcome back. We've been seeing this whole transracialism thing popping up more and more online, like on TikTok and stuff. And we figured, hey, it's time for a deep dive. We've got all sorts of sources lined up, articles, videos, even some Reddit threads, all to get a handle on this whole concept, the arguments, the ethics, the whole shebang.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that gets people talking, and for good reason, right? I mean, it really makes you think about race and identity and how we understand ourselves in the world today, with all its diversity and constant change.
So true. And where do we even begin with something like this? Well, I think it makes sense to start with definitions, right? One of the YouTube videos we found, it's called In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA, and it jumps right into how race is defined. But here's the thing. It's not as straightforward as you might think.
Yeah, it's not like there's one simple answer, is there? The video actually points out that race can be seen as this combination of physical traits, genetics, ancestry, even culture and behavior. It's almost like a pie, with all these different slices, and people tend to emphasize different slices depending on their perspective.
That's such a good analogy. And you know what else this video highlights? It talks about how race has been used throughout history to, well, justify some really terrible things like caste systems, exploitation, even genocide. It's pretty heavy stuff, and it makes you realize how loaded this whole concept of race really is.
It is, and that's why it's so important to keep that historical context in mind as we delve into transracialism. It's a conversation that's deeply intertwined with power dynamics and oppression, and we can't ignore that.
Couldn't agree more. So, okay, we've talked about how tricky it is to define race, but what about transracialism itself? What exactly are we talking about here? A bunch of our sources, those YouTube videos like In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA, and Transracialism, is it possible to change one's race? Right? That Reddit post called RCTA. Understanding RCTA, they all point to this idea that people can identify as a race different from the one they were assigned at birth.
Right, and it's an idea that's been gaining more and more attention in recent years. Think about the case of Rachel Dolezal, for example.
Yeah.
She identified as Black, even though her parents were white, and that sparked a huge controversy a few years back. It really brought this whole transracialism debate into the spotlight.
And then there's Oli London, right? He went through multiple surgeries to try and look like a Korean pop idol, and that also caused a lot of backlash. A lot of people accused him of fetishizing Korean culture rather than genuinely identifying as Korean.
Those cases definitely highlight the gray areas surrounding transracialism. It's really difficult to pin down exactly what it means, and there's this ongoing debate about where the line is between genuine identification and, well, cultural appropriation. Like, how can you tell if someone is truly identifying with another race or just appropriating elements of their culture?
Right. It's a super thorny issue. And I think it's interesting because one of the YouTube videos, the YouTuber who doesn't get racism, makes the argument that simply enjoying aspects of another culture doesn't automatically mean you're transracial. Like they use the example of people who are really into Japanese culture because of anime. That doesn't mean they think they're Japanese.
Exactly. It comes down to whether someone is just appreciating another culture or whether they truly believe they belong to a different race, even if their biological ancestry doesn't necessarily reflect that.
And, it's fascinating because our sources talk about all these different ways people within the online transracial community are trying to, I guess, express or embody this sense of belonging. Some people are using subliminal messages, like they think they can actually shift their race through repeated exposure to certain images or audio. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it is. And then there's face claiming,
Yeah.
which is basically digitally altering images to make yourself look like a different race. I mean, that's become pretty common online, and it raises all sorts of questions about identity and self-perception and the influence of societal beauty standards. It's a whole other layer to this conversation.
And it gets even more, I don't know, complex maybe when you bring in body modification. Some people are going to pretty extreme lengths, like changing their hairstyles, makeup, getting tans, even surgery, all to try and align themselves physically with a particular racial identity. We saw examples of this in the videos like In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA, and research like transracial identity and the effect on the life circumstances, a pilot study in 14 participants.
It's definitely a practice that raises a lot of eyebrows, but I think it also shows just how deeply some people feel this disconnect between their internal identity and their external appearance. It's about trying to bridge that gap, even if it means pushing boundaries and challenging societal norms.
Yeah, it's like that fundamental human desire to be seen and understood for who you truly are, even if it doesn't fit neatly into the boxes society has created, right?
Absolutely. But, to really grapple with the arguments for and against transracialism, I think we need to tackle this big idea of race as a social construct. This comes up a lot in our sources, like the Wikipedia article, Ethnicity Wikipedia, the YouTube video, What is Race, Biology, and Social Construction, and that Reddit post you mentioned, RCTA, Understanding RCTA.
Okay, so what does that even mean? Race is a social construct.
Right.
Break that down for us.
Sure. So basically, the argument is that race isn't just about biology or genetics. It's also about how society views and categorizes people based on certain physical characteristics, cultural practices, and even historical narratives. It's like society creates these categories, and then we attach all sorts of meanings and assumptions to them.
So it's less about what's in your DNA and more about how you're perceived and treated by society.
Exactly. And if that's the case, if race is primarily a social construct, then some people argue that individuals should have the autonomy to identify with the race that aligns with their lived experiences and self-perception. It's like saying, hey, if these categories are socially constructed anyway, why shouldn't people have a say in which category they belong to?
I mean, that's a pretty compelling argument when you put it that way. It's like if society is imposing these categories on us in the first place, shouldn't we have some agency in how we define ourselves within those categories?
Yeah, that's the line of thinking. And, some people even draw a parallel between transracialism and transgenderism, arguing that if we accept gender identity as fluid, then maybe racial identity can be fluid too. We saw this in videos like In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA, and let's all get past this confusion about trans people.
It's a fascinating comparison for sure. But I'm guessing there are some strong counterarguments to this whole idea too, right?
Of course. I mean, one of the main concerns that comes up in sources like the Reddit post RCTA, Understanding RCTA, and the YouTube video, The YouTuber Who Doesn't Get Racism, is cultural appropriation. The idea that someone might be adopting elements of a race they don't belong to without truly understanding or respecting the cultural context. And that can be really problematic.
Right, because it can feel like you're taking something that's not yours to take and maybe even exploiting or misrepresenting another culture for your own personal gain. It's a valid concern.
Absolutely. And then there's the argument that transracialism might actually trivialize the historical and ongoing struggles that marginalized racial groups have faced. Like, can someone who hasn't lived through those experiences truly understand what it means to belong to that race? And does claiming that identity somehow diminish the experiences of those who have been marginalized based on their race? These are tough questions.
They really are. And it's interesting because this whole discussion about race and how it's defined made me think about how different cultures view race.
Hmm.
The Wikipedia article on ethnicity we looked at, it actually highlights how the understanding of race varies across different cultural contexts. Like take Brazil, for example.
Oh, that's a great example. In Brazil, racial categories are much more fluid than they are in, say, the United States. It's more of a spectrum based on physical appearance rather than these rigid classifications. It's a completely different way of thinking about race.
It is. And it shows you that this whole concept of race, it's not some universal truth. It's heavily influenced by social and historical factors, and each culture has its own way of understanding and categorizing race.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to these questions, is there? And it makes this whole discussion about transracialism even more complex and nuanced. It really makes you realize, how complicated this whole issue is. It's not just about what one person chooses. It's about recognizing how that choice might affect other people, especially groups that have, historically been marginalized and oppressed because of their race.
That's a really good point. It's like trying to find that balance between personal freedom and, social responsibility. And it kind of leads into one of the big criticisms of transracialism, right? This idea that it could undermine the experiences and struggles of those marginalized groups.
Exactly. One of the YouTube videos we watched, Transracialism, is it possible to change one's race? A philosopher in that video, he argues that racial identity is so closely tied to these shared experiences of oppression. It's not something you can fully understand unless you've lived through it.
Yeah, they use the example of those Canadian and Indian residential schools, the ones that tried to completely erase indigenous culture.
Yeah.
The video argues that someone who hasn't gone through that specific historical trauma they can't truly understand what it means to identify as indigenous.
It's a strong argument. And then you have this whole other layer, right? How race intersects with power dynamics. There's a Wikipedia article, Race, Human Categorization, Wikipedia, and it talks about how these racial categories have historically been used to create like hierarchies, which then leads to discrimination and inequality.
So basically, critics of transracialism are worried that, like, if we let people just choose their race, it could ignore or even erase these very real power structures that, have shaped racial identities and continue to affect people's lives today.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that race isn't just some personal preference, It's embedded in these social systems that have, well, basically favored certain groups while putting others at a disadvantage.
It makes you think about how these conversations, like how they play out in different parts of the world. We were talking earlier about how Brazil has a more, I guess, fluid understanding of race. But even there, they have a history of colonialism and slavery that still influences their racial dynamics.
Oh, for sure. It's a good reminder that even in cultures where those racial categories seem more flexible, that historical context and those social hierarchies, they still matter a lot. But hey, you know what? Maybe we should switch gears a bit and talk about how people who identify as transracial actually try to express this sense of belonging, in a practical sense.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. A couple of the sources we looked at, like that YouTube video in defense of transracialism, RCTA, and the Reddit posts RCTA, Understanding RCTA, they give some insights into the practices and trends within this community. One thing that really stood out to me was the use of subliminal messages. It's like almost like a do-it-yourself approach to, I don't know, racial transformation.
It is pretty fascinating how people are using technology and online platforms to explore and, I guess, experiment with identity in these new ways. But it also makes you wonder, right? Like, are these methods actually effective? And what are the potential risks involved?
Right. And it's not just about those subliminal messages either. We've got face claiming, which is like digitally altering images to make yourself appear as a different race. I mean, we see that everywhere online these days, and it brings up those ethical dilemmas around authenticity and representation and, the potential to reinforce harmful stereotypes.
Definitely some ethical gray areas there. And then on top of that, you have the more physical transformations, right? Everything from hairstyles and makeup to tanning and in some cases even surgery. Remember that study we looked at? Transracial identity and the effect on the life circumstances? A pilot study in 14 participants.
Yeah, they found that a significant number of the people they studied had actually gone through some kind of body modification to try and align with their chosen ethnicity.
Hmm.
I think they even mentioned someone who had a nose job to look more British. I mean, it really shows you the lengths some people are willing to go to physically embody their desired racial identity.
Hmm.
And it's not just limited to one culture or racial group either. It's across the board.
And while some people might look at those transformations and think, wow, that's extreme, I think it's important to remember that it often comes from this really deep feeling of dissonance between like your inner identity and your outward appearance. It's about trying to bring those two things into alignment, even if it means challenging what society considers normal or acceptable.
It goes back to that desire we were talking about earlier, wanting to be seen for who you truly feel you are, even if it doesn't fit into those neat little boxes that society tries to put us in.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's crucial to approach these practices with, a sense of empathy and understanding, even if we don't personally agree with them. We have to try to understand the motivations behind them.
Totally. Recognizing that identity is complex and multifaceted is so important. And for some people, that journey of self-discovery might involve exploring their racial identity in ways that push boundaries.
Mhm.
It's all part of this larger conversation about who we are and how we define ourselves.
Absolutely. And as we go deeper into this conversation, I think it's important to acknowledge that even within the transracial community, there's a whole spectrum of perspectives. It's not like everyone who identifies as transracial thinks exactly the same way.
That's a good point. Like that YouTube video, In Defense of Transracialism RCTA, it gives a platform to people who identify as transracial and believe they have a right to, like, self-determination when it comes to their racial identity.
Yeah.
They really emphasize the fluidity of identity in today's world and advocate for, everyone's freedom to express themselves authentically, even if it goes against societal norms.
It's about challenging those rigid categories and embracing the incredible diversity of human experience.
Right. But at the same time, there are other voices within the community who are maybe a bit more cautious and recognize the importance of being sensitive and respectful, especially when it comes to cultural appropriation and those historical power dynamics we talked about.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Reddit post RCTA, understanding RCTA, it really highlights these concerns and emphasizes the importance of engaging with other cultures in a way that's like informed and respectful and avoids perpetuating those harmful stereotypes.
It all circles back to that balance we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Finding that sweet spot between individual expression and social responsibility. And it becomes even more crucial when you think about the bigger societal implications of transracialism. Because it's not just about personal choices, it's about how those choices might influence the wider conversations we're having about race, identity, and belonging.
No doubt. And that's where things can get really tricky, especially as we navigate this world where identity is becoming more and more fluid and the lines between racial and ethnic groups are becoming increasingly blurred. Like, how do we reconcile this growing fluidity with the need to acknowledge and respect the history and the lived realities of groups that have been marginalized?
It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, on the one hand, we want to embrace diversity and allow people to express their identities in whatever way feels authentic to them. But on the other hand, we have to be mindful of those power dynamics that have shaped how we understand race. And we have to make sure that groups that have been historically disadvantaged aren't further marginalized or erased in the process.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. It's about finding that delicate balance. And I think open dialogue is key. Empathy, a willingness to listen and learn from different perspectives, even when they challenge our own. Those are all essential.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what we're trying to do here today, right? Explore this complex topic from different angles, encourage critical thinking about how identity is evolving in the 21st century. It's all about creating that space for thoughtful discussion and understanding, even when there's disagreement or discomfort.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, this is a conversation that affects all of us as individuals and as a society.
It feels like we're in this really weird in-between place with how we see identity.
Mm.
And technology is just like throwing gasoline on the fire. Think about stuff like gene editing and virtual avatars. It's already messing with the lines between what's physical and what's virtual.
Yeah, it's exciting and kind of freaky at the same time. Imagine like people changing their genes or switching between digital identities that go way beyond our usual ideas of race. What would that do to how we think about race and belonging?
Blows my mind. And the ethical questions, oh man. One of our sources, the Genome Editing Wikipedia article, talks about how gene editing could actually change physical traits,
Yeah.
even the ones we associate with race.
And even though it's still early days for that tech, it's not hard to imagine a future where people could just edit out racial features or even like design their kids to be a certain race.
It's like something out of a movie, but it's getting more and more real, right?
Yeah. So then you got to wonder if people could literally choose their race on a genetic level, would that just like make this whole transracialism thing disappear? Or would it just make things even more complicated? Tough one. It really makes you think about what we can control, what identity even means, and what it means to be human. And it goes beyond physical stuff, too. Virtual worlds and avatars, they're already blurring the lines between who we are online and who we are in real life.
That's so true. People making these digital versions of themselves, they're totally different from their physical selves. And that includes race. It's like that whole question, if a tree falls in the forest. But now it's, if I say I'm a different race online, does that make it any less real than my race in the physical world?
Philosophers and scientists are wrestling with that right now, and there are no easy answers. But one thing's for sure, those online experiences can have real effects on how we see ourselves and others. It's not just a game.
So where do we even go from here? How do we make sense of race and ethnicity when tech is changing how we understand identity so fast?
I think it starts with being open and honest about race. We have to listen to each other, really listen, and understand those historical injustices that got us to where we are today. We can't just sweep that under the rug.
And we have to be willing to learn, be curious, and question what we think we know. It's about building a world that's fair for everyone, where everyone feels seen and respected, no matter their race.
Well said. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you listening out there. Keep digging into these ideas, talk to each other, and consider how your own ideas about race and identity are changing in this crazy, fast-moving world.
It's been a wild ride for sure. And remember, folks, the conversation doesn't stop here. This is an ongoing thing, learning, unlearning, and figuring out how we connect with each other and the world around us.
Until next time, keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep the conversation alive.